future. I'll restart that. Good thought. Thanks everybody for coming to this workshop. It's titled Eco-Socialist Organizing for a Green Future. We're going to cover a real quick kind of what is eco-socialism. I have done workshops on this topic for many years. I've got my degrees in political philosophy. I'm a former community organizer, former preschool teacher. My name's Chris Blankenhorn, by the way. I'm with the Illinois Green Party. So we're going to start out with a real quick, discussion of, what is eco-socialism? Like I said, I've been doing eco-socialism workshops for a number of years. I have done multi-hour presentations on this, right? I've taken, and so I'm going to give it 10 minutes, and I really don't want to bog down in that. There's, that's kind of not, we want to pivot to organizing, but we kind of got to get a foundation laid out. So I'm going to talk about that real quick. Howie's going to then take that political theory and discuss the policy implementations of it, with the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal that he ran in 2020 being a big piece of that. And then we're going to pivot into, local manifestations. What does it mean to be an eco-socialist organizer in your community? And, that's where we really want to have the discussion. If someone wants to debate me about the readings and authors and things that I cite in my definition of eco-socialism, I'm more than happy to do that, but I really don't want to do that today. That is a lesson I've learned. In 2017, I was part of the Young Eco-Socialists, which is our youth caucus, and we presented a workshop on eco-socialism at the annual national meeting that year, and we didn't get past point 1 on our agenda because it was open to that level of discussion. So, like I said, my name's Chris Blankenhorn. I'll let Howie introduce himself when he gets started. I've been involved with the Green Party on the national level since 2013. I'm currently the Illinois Green Party secretary. I've served as a national co-chair for the Green Party of the United States from 2016 to 2018. And I was the social media and tech director for our 2020 Hawkins Walker presidential campaign. Presently, I do a lot of my work for the Green Socialist Organizing Project, working on education stuff like Eco-Socialism 101. Just so to start out, a little history with the Green Party. In 2016, we passed a platform amendment, which is generally referred to as 835, and it, for the first time, expressed that the Green Party was an eco-socialist, anti-capitalist political party. This passed with about 80% of the vote of the National Committee. Back then, I was doing workshops advocating for us to be a eco-socialist party. Luckily, I don't really feel the need to do those workshops anymore. That battle has largely been fought in one party. Obviously, we still have a wide range of beliefs within the party, but that's been pretty well solidified. Our platform can still be a little contradictory, as any giant platform that's been edited for years can be, but 2016 was the really big turning. But that said, that was just when it became explicit, right? There were socialists in the room at the first Green Party gathering in 1984 in Minnesota. One of them's on this call and is my co-presenter, and Howie Hawkins, right? Socialists have been here from the beginning. Socialism has been a big part of green values, even if it wasn't explicitly listed out until 2018. And I'll touch on that a little bit after I, get through some of the theory, side of things. But, so eco-socialism, right? What does it mean? How does it differ? In the past, we've spent hours on what is socialism, what is capitalism, that kind of thing. I kind of want to give a little history of how we got here. Right? How did we get to what I would consider as a green, manifestation of eco-socialism? So to do that, I'm going to go back a few hundred years, right? Starting with the European Enlightenment. We see advancements in philosophy and the sciences. That's followed, I'm going to go real quick through all of this, but that's followed by, philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and Feuerbach, getting into dialectic thinking, philosophy being applied to social relations and international relations, discussions of peace and things like that. I will say, my degree is in political and social philosophy, and I am a snob in that regard. I'm not into ethics. I'm not into a lot of the things that are talked about in generic philosophy courses. I'm really big on how does it impact the world, and our material conditions. That kind of simultaneously with all of that, we've got the early utopian socialists in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Saint Simon, talking about the working class must be well taken care of for an efficient economy and effective society. Owen, talking about better working conditions, shorter working hours, taking care of workers, including providing education to families. And Owen himself tried to start many utopian communities. Fourier, who identified poverty as a major problem affecting society and advanced higher wages, workers' rights, women's rights, feminism, education, right? These are things we're still fighting about today. And that's a pretty common theme when you talk, to socialist theory. We're still talking about these things today, right? But you can see right alongside capitalism, right? As modern capitalism formed and grew, the critiques were there. It's laying a foundation for socialist thought. Following up, obviously, with the big name in the room, when it comes to this type of stuff, Karl Marx and Marxism. You've got the Manifesto of the Communist Party with in 1948 with Engels, or 1848, 1867, first volume of Capital, right? Marx's key break from those early socialists was the state. Was seen as something to be ended instead of being viewed as that kind of ideal form, right? Those Enlightenment thinkers came out, in contemporarily with, the nation state really coming into its modern form. And so Marx had a big break with that. Marx hypothesized the state would wither away. It's one of the reasons I still, when people ask me where I am, Marxist is always on the list, and the withering state is one of those reasons. I'm a bottom left, anarchist. So, that said, there's major tendencies in Marxism. Marxism didn't start, socialism didn't start, communism didn't start with Marx. We talked about that lead up with Hegel and Feuerbach, right? And then it's splitting. So we've got orthodox Marxism, like Kautsky, social democracy with Bernstein, Marxist Leninism with Lenin, and then you've got the libertarian Marxists, who are much more in line, with green politics, with lesser people like Luxemburg and Panacek. They were critical of other forms of Marxism for being authoritarian, and they sought bottom-up organization of workers via worker councils and other forms like that. So, as Marx is coming out, there's splits within Marxism, and then there's the anarchists who are also contemporaries, folks like Proudhon and the mutualists, Bakunin and the collectivists. Mutualism and collectivism became kind of branched, and they became anarcho-communists like Kropotkin, or anarcho-syndicalists like Rock. But especially because we're living in the United States, or most of us are, we've kind of seen a lot of these ideas, skewed. One of my favorite things when I meet a libertarian is to say, "Oh, you must like Proudhon," and they almost always don't know who he is, and but he's the coiner of the term, right? He's one of the people who originally coined the word libertarianism, and it was a branch of anarchism that was not only anti-state, but anti-hierarchy in general and anti-capitalist. So these, all when Marxism and the early ideas of what we consider socialism forming, there's all kinds of currents in this debate. These folks were contemporaries, and they did debate each other. There's generally three main points of disagreement. This is taken from Dan Chortikoff, but class analysis, recognize the importance of class struggle, but disagreement in who to organize for change. Organizational form, central party versus decentralized movement, and then the role of the state, right? Whether Marx called for a dictatorship of the proletariat, but he also wanted it to wither. So there's conflict over that in terms of Marxism. And then Marxism, continues well after Marx himself. One of my favorite kind of paths to trace from Marx is, when Marx was writing, there wasn't a unified German state. England and France had unique cultures and identities. Capitalism hadn't become global. And so that's one of the areas where he was kind of missing. But then, in the 1920s, alongside the rise of the Soviet Union, oh, sorry, you get Gramsci to come out and propose cultural hegemony and really start to get into that molding of culture and capital, right? The idea that capitalism is now going beyond just an economic system. And a fun fact about Gramsci, his prison notebooks were translated into English by Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg's dad. So, Buttigieg came from a leftist tradition and somehow ended up as a pretty moderate Democrat. But, so we get Gramsci bringing in culture. Into the post-war era, you get people like Horkheimer and Adorno talking about the culture industry and how, capitalism is now manufacturing culture. You get into Guy Debord and the Society of Spectacle. You get into Kristeva bringing Freud into the mix, Angela Davis bringing in race. All of a sudden, Marxism, and that's a big thing, important thing to understand about socialism in general. It didn't start and end with one thinker. It's always being expanded. It's always part of that dialectic debate. And then, so, that's our kind of key fight, or, that's that Marxist history. But there's something more beyond that, right? When we're talking about eco-socialism, the connection between society and nature really started to come up. And there's people like Saito who were even writing about, that Marx had this in there, it just wasn't fully developed yet, this ecology. But that's where folks like Murray Bookchin, who was influential in the founding of the Green Party. Bookchin said, until society can be reclaimed by undivided humanity, that it will use its collective wisdom, cultural achievements, technology, innovation, scientific knowledge, and innate creativity for its own benefit and for that of the natural world, all of ecological problems will have their root in social problems, right? So understanding that our society was having that impact on the world, on the natural world. And so that now we're starting to get into trends that are trending towards the bottom left eco-socialism, right? So social ecology out of Bookchin, the Eco-Socialist Manifesto came from Howie, and then eco-Marxism with Burkett, Foster, and I mentioned Saito. So there's this kind of growing ideas, right? And the key elements that kind of formed out of this social ecology that are really, really influential. Probably, I would say more so than the Marxist tradition that underlies it, that underlies socialism. Those key elements of social ecology, drawing from the past, present, and future to develop an ecological, libertarian, socialist framework that focuses on non-hierarchy, direct democracy, social justice, ecology, and a moral economy. And so that starts leading us towards the Green Party, right? Ecological socialists started entering into electoral politics as part of this leftist coalitions in the 1970s. The German Green Party saw success in the 80s. They even had their own kind of split, the Relos versus the Fundos, kind of about how to deal with that success. Bookchin's Institute for Social Ecology then hosted, the first conference in 1984, where we had social ecology really driving the formation of the Green Party, with the party then being formed, in the coming years, in the coming decade. In 91, there was the Green Party USA, the Greens, and then GPUS, our current form, coming together in 2000. So there's this long, history of green socialism. And when you look at it, right, when you to pivot kind of to Howie, when you look at those 10 key values, those core green values, through the lens of capitalism can't abide by a single one, right? grassroots democracy. Capitalism is a hierarchical system, literally built into U.S. capitalism is in opposition to grassroots democracy, right? The Senate exists because they were scared of the people. The Electoral College exists because they were scared of the people. They said these things outright. They were not shy about about creating, their democracy that wasn't democratic. Capitalism is not a democratic system. Social justice and equal opportunity, again, right? Look at what capitalism has produced. We have massive social inequality, even with forced, opportunity through things like, through things like quotas and such. It can't even do it even when it's being forced, right? The divide and conquer of capitalism just does not comply. Ecological wisdom. There's nothing ecologically wise about capitalism, right? We're burning the world to the ground. That's just by existing in the capitalist system. Nonviolence. Capitalism is extraordinarily violent, and that's before we even get into, the demand, the wars for market, right? On an individual level, right? Poverty and oppression. Capitalism is violent to its core. Decentralized, it is, again, antithetical. It's the opposite, right? Capitalism is about centralizing that power, centralizing that power. It's not community economics in the same way. If we're centralizing, we're moving away from the community. Feminism and gender inequality, just like with that social justice, it does not comply. Respect for diversity, no. Personal and global responsibility. There's nothing responsible about capitalism, right? Nothing on a personal or global level. In the future focus is sustainability. Capitalism just isn't sustainable. We're driving off the cliff right now. It's just not possible. So I'm going to throw a couple of links into the chat. Like I said, I just burned through in 10 minutes something that I usually spend an hour plus. Right. So, and I know that, but I just wanted to kind of lay that. How do we get here, right? There's a long trajectory both of socialism towards ecological socialism, right, towards an eco-socialist future, as well as within the Green Party, right? Socialists were in the room from the beginning, and we've been major drivers of the party for a long time. And a big part of that is, right, when you look at those green values, they just can't comply. Capitalism just can't comply. It breaks every single one of them at every turn. And so what does that look like, right? How does this theory then turn into something real and tangible? And I just want to lead into Howie say, one of the things I was most proud about working on Howie's campaign was that we took it beyond slogans and we took it beyond ideas. We presented a 10-year balanced budget that would transition us towards eco-socialism, that would have us at 100% renewable and clean energy in all sectors by 2030, right? We didn't just say we want Medicare for all. We laid out a plan for a national health service and how we would get there. And so, how that manifests into policy, I'll leave to Howie, but I have to say, I just wanted to say that like I said, one of my proudest things about working on that campaign was the level of that kind of manifestation, eco-socialist thought into practical policy states that Howie's going to talk to. And then after that, we can talk about, well, how does that translate down to our local level? But I'm going to dump a bunch of links in the chat.
Okay, well, I'm Howie Hawkins. I was there at that meeting 40 years ago in August 1984 in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we had our first National Green Party organizing meeting. It actually wasn't sponsored by Bookchin's Institute for Social Ecology. They were invited to send some people. And they invited me as a member of the Clamshell Alliance. Well, they invited the Clamshell Alliance to send a couple of people. So me and Guy Chichester went. So yeah, I've been active for 40 years in the Green Party. I won't go into it all, but I was our candidate for president in 2020, and we ran on an eco-socialist Green New Deal. So I want to talk about that program as a transitional program to an eco-socialist society. So I'll talk about the history of the Green New Deal and its grassroots democratic core in its eco-socialist form. And I'll start by addressing a question I just saw in the chat. Or, are we talking about reforming capitalism or revolutionizing, transforming the system? And I think it's the latter. We mobilize people around reforms that people say are common sense. Like, if you're willing and able to work and there's not a job in the private sector, the public sector should provide a job for you so you can contribute. That's a reform, but it stretches capitalism because the capitalists like a slack labor market so they can keep wages down. And when people find out that the system resists, then they get radicalized. And in the end, the capitalists have extra parliamentary powers outside of government, like where they're going to invest. They can go on a capital strike and wreck the economy for a reformed government. And the question then is, are people going to take direct action to implement the program they voted for? Seize the factories, bring them under workers' control, that kind of thing. So I don't think we should counterpose reform or revolution, but the revolutionaries should be leaders in reform campaigns. So where did this Green New Deal come from? The basic approach of a Green New Deal for economic and environmental justice linked together has been at the center of green politics from the beginning. Go back to Rudi Dutschke, the leader of the New Left in Germany, German SDS, the Socialist Youth Group, who then spent the 70s crisscrossing Germany, calling for a Green Party that would be an alternative that was more democratic in its socialism than the Soviet bloc one-party states, as well as the Western European social democracies, which had nationalized some industries, but on a very centralized bureaucratic basis. So that democratic core I want to talk about. Now, we have had this basic program, but we didn't call it the Green New Deal until recently. In 2000, I proposed to we had two Green parties back then, the Green Party USA and the Association of State Green Parties. And I proposed to the Green Party USA convention that we have a global Green New Deal. And they didn't like that. They liked the content, but they didn't like the label because New Deal was too associated with the Democratic Party. So we called it the Global Green Deal. And it was about reinvesting deep cuts in military spending in a peace dividend that would fully fund the UN Development Report's $40 billion budget to meet the basic needs of people everywhere for food, clean water, sanitation, shelter, preventive health care, and elementary education. And also to finance and technically assist the ecological conversion of human civilization to sustainable systems of production, clean energy, but also non-toxic production and manufacturing and so forth. So ironically, the European Greens started using the Green New Deal slogan in their 2000 Euro parliamentary campaign. And today they're just calling it the Green Deal. So whatever we call it, the basic idea or the slogan really came from the British Greens in 2007 and 2008 in response to the Great Recession, the big financial crisis. And so they argued and put forward a program to do massive investments in a conversion of the energy system to renewable energy as a way of stimulating the economy and getting us out of the Great Recession. And so the British Greens are using it. The next year, the European Greens picked it up for their Euro parliamentary election campaign. So when I was asked to run for governor by the Green Party in New York, I said, we should run on a Green New Deal. And I got the same pushback. No, New Deal, that's Democratic Party. And I had two arguments. Look, the British Greens are using it. The European Greens are using it. And also it appeals to progressive Democrats who, when they think of the New Deal, or when they think of the Democratic Party, they think of the New Deal, those public programs that the Democrats actually abandoned when they turned to neoliberalism in the 1970s, or even a little bit under Johnson in the 60s. So we agreed to make that our theme and put out our programs, and it really caught on in the media, among people, along with our demands like for a ban on fracking, when the rest of the environmental movement, the moderates were calling for a, what were they calling for? A moratorium and a study. And we were saying, yeah, you want to do that to see if it poisons the water, but we're saying we can't burn this natural gas because of the climate. And that demand caught on. And everybody turned around after that election in the environmental movement and adopted our demand. So after a couple of months of doing that in New York, Greens around the country said, let's put forward a statement for a federal Green New Deal and deal with the federal issues like the military budget that needs to be cut to fund a federal Green New Deal, the fact that states and localities, because they have to have balanced budgets, are limited in how much they can invest in the Green New Deal. So we have to get the federal government to fund it. And so I forget, it was like 70 Greens, many of them candidates, signed on to that statement by August of 2010. And then Jill Stein made the slogan, a Green New Deal for America, her slogan for her 2012 and 2016 campaign. So this became the Green Party's signature issue. And then, of course, the Democrats caught their eye. So we come to 2018 and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wins a surprise election in a primary, and she ran on a Green New Deal. And we know where she got it from. She got it from her campaign manager, VG Ramos, who the previous year had managed the campaign of a Green candidate for city council, who was running on adapting our Green New Deal to New York City. AOC's never acknowledged where it came from, but when she went to when the Sunrise Movement asked her to come to a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, after she was elected, before she took office, she said, let's demand a Green New Deal. And that went viral in the media. And that's when the Green New Deal really became a topic of conversation. Now, Pelosi, of course, would not let them, they were demanding a select committee that could put climate legislation and Green New Deal legislation directly to the House floor for a vote. And Pelosi said, nah, you're going to have to take your bills through the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is run by a fossil-fueled New Jersey machine politician named Frank Pallone. So that was a dead end. So AOC got together with Senator Ed Markey in Massachusetts to propose a non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. But that resolution really watered down what we had been talking about. It cut out our ban on fracking and all new fossil fuel infrastructure. It cut out our rapid phase out of nuclear power. It cut out our deep cuts in military spending to help pay for the Green New Deal. And it postponed the deadline to get to zero emissions by 20 years, from 2030 to 2050. And instead of talking about real zero emissions, they started talking about net zero emissions, which leaves the door open to fossil fuel burning with the fantasy of carbon capture and sequestration. And even with that diluted Green New Deal, Pelosi would never bring it to the floor for a vote. But in the Senate, the Republican Majority Leader McConnell said, oh yeah, we'll have everybody vote on it, because the Republicans have been saying a bunch of outlandish lies about the New Deal, Green New Deal, and they wanted to get the Democratic senators on the record. So that scared the Democrats. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said it was a trick. It was a Republican trick, and he advised everybody to vote against it. And all those damn Democrats voted against their own Green New Deal, including Ed Markey, who co-sponsored it, including Bernie Sanders, including, yes, Kamala Harris. So, you know, the Democrats took up the slogan and they wouldn't even vote for it in watered down form. But nevertheless, public opinion polls were showing 60%, sometimes over 70% of the public wanted this Green New Deal. So it became an issue in the Democratic primaries in 2020. And all the candidates had to have a climate action program and take a position on the Green New Deal. Most of them avoided the Green New Deal slogan, Joe Biden in particular. But others adopted it, including Kamala Harris. And she had the second most ambitious program. It was a $10 trillion program over 10 years, although most of it would be incentivized public spending and, you know, tax credits and subsidies to get private investment. The most ambitious program, and it was a serious program, was Bernie Sanders. It was $16 trillion over 10 years, And it was public programs. It was New Deal style public programs. So come to 2020, we decided we had to run with an adjective in front of Green New Deal, the eco-socialist Green New Deal, to distinguish ourselves from what the Democrats were doing. And we priced out what it would cost. And I will put in the chat when I'm through talking a link to our eco-socialist Green New Deal budget. And it was 42 trillion over 10 years. Now, we were more ambitious in time scale and in all the things we wanted to change. 1.4 trillion a year or 14 trillion over the 10 years was for the Economic Bill of Rights, for a living wage, a guaranteed living wage job, income above poverty, affordable housing, comprehensive health care for all, lifelong public education, and a secure retirement. And then 27 trillion is what it would cost for the ecological conversion of all production systems to 100% clean energy and zero waste and pollution. Kamala Harris, just to finish up on her, she dropped out of the primary, and when she became the vice presidential candidate, she was allergic to the Green New Deal slogan, just like Joe Biden was. So we had brought the Green New Deal, as I mentioned, in 2010 forward, and it was socialist in content. We called for public power, public housing, much more public transportation, public manufacturing in key sectors to be coordinated by a state planning agency accountable to locally elected boards for these socialized sectors. But we just called it the Green New Deal. We began calling for eco-socialism when I ran again in 2018 without appending it to the Green New Deal, because at that point, the word socialism had become very popular, particularly among people we wanted to reach. Young people, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, had exploded, from a few thousand to 90,000 members, many of them in New York State. So we talked about eco-socialism along with the Green New Deal. So that's what we brought into the 2020 presidential campaign. That's when we labeled it the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal. So that's the background on how we got to where we are today. Now, what I want to talk about now is basically three versions of the Green New Deal that are out there for discussion: the New Deal or Keynesian version, the neoliberal version, and the eco-socialist version. Now, New Deal invokes Keynesian-style public programs. They're not designed to transform capitalism to a democratic socialist economy. They're designed to fill in the gaps where capitalism fails, where the market fails, and mitigate some of the bad outcomes of capitalism. So the New Deal, they did public programs like public power, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the rural electric cooperatives to provide electricity where the private industry, the investor-owned utilities or IOUs, wouldn't, because it was not as profitable. They created public jobs for the unemployed, public housing for the ill-housed and unhoused. But the reality of the climate and related social programs that the Democrats have adopted under Biden, and the progressive Democrats, some of them DSA members, tout as well, is neoliberal. That is, they are market-based, and they feature public incentives for private corporations and consumers. Let me give you a couple examples. What's now called the American Climate Corps. It was supposed to be modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s New Deal. The CCC, as it was called, was a public program. It employed 2 million people as public employees to implement a national plan for soil and forest conservation and public parks. So people like the Sunrise Movement campaigned for a civilian climate corps. Biden calls it an American Climate Corps, but it's a neoliberal program of public subsidies for private actions. It's a grants program through AmeriCorps. It's not based on a national plan. It only employs 20,000 people compared to 2 million people in the New Deal CCC. And it is a hit or miss program. There's no national plan to do the projects that need to be done to deal with this climate crisis. And because it's a grants program, it advantages the privileged. The Indigenous Environmental Network has really criticized it and other environmental justice programs and other legislation because it depends on this grants process. It leaves out the poorer communities and environmental justice organizations and biases who gets the grants toward the well-funded nonprofits and local governments and state governments. And the Sunrise Movement, which was the major proponent of this civilian climate corps, has not even recognized, or if they recognize it, they did not acknowledge that this was a neoliberal perversion of the public program that was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Another example I'll give is, power. Instead of public power like the New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority and the electric cooperatives, the neoliberal clean energy program is based on public subsidies for private corporations and consumers. Again, it is hit or miss. If what they are trying to incentivize is unprofitable, it won't get done. An example here is offshore wind. A lot of projects were planned, but then interest rates were raised, borrowing costs went up, and so those projects were canceled or postponed. And what we've got to do is borrow money now to implement this program. And cuts in military spending and higher taxes on the rich will help, but they're not enough because of the massive scale of investments we need to make up front. So that's why we need an eco-socialist Green New Deal. We need public ownership and planning in key sectors in order to plan and coordinate the complexities of a rapid transition to 100% clean energy and real zero, and then negative carbon emissions. Those sectors should include energy, transportation, manufacturing, housing, and banking. For example, in electric power production, the IOUs will not invest in the smart grid we need for distributed solar and wind power to replace the servo-mechanical grid they now have based on centralized nuclear and fossil fuel power plants until the old grid and those plants wear out. And then maybe they'll go to the smart grid and renewables. But we don't have time for that. The same goes, for example, for the steel industry. Steel industry is not going to just stop using their carbon-emitting coke ovens and replace them with carbon-free hydrogen and electric arc furnaces until the old equipment wears out. So what we need to do to move industries like steel and cement and chemicals to the new clean technologies now to meet the climate challenge is bring them under public ownership, borrow the money to make that transition now, and plan their implementation. Now, public enterprise and this money we borrow will still have to be covered in the long run, but public enterprise has a longer time horizon and can pay off the initial investment over time. So like sales from carbon-free steel and cement and chemicals will cover the cost of building the new green production technologies just over a longer period of time. Utility bills in the public power system will cover the cost of building clean renewables. Fares will cover the cost of building out a first-class mass transit and freight and rail passenger system. Rent scale to income and mixed income public housing will cover the cost of those housing projects over time. So planning enabled by public ownership will enable us also to integrate these different sectors. For example, take public transportation and public housing. One of our goals should be to build walkable communities, including transforming our existing urban and suburban areas as well as rural towns into walkable communities. Walkable communities greatly reduce the energy needed, particularly for energy-intensive automobiles, and even before electric vehicles, it will remain carbon intensive even before we get electric vehicles. But even when we do, it's going to be more energy intensive to run those electric vehicles all around instead of being in neighborhoods where you can walk to the store and to school and to work and so forth. So the increase in walking and cycling and the decrease in air and noise pollution will also enhance public health. But you're not going to be able to coordinate and effectively implement this walkable communities approach without coordinating new public transportation routes and the location of public housing to help, densify these communities so they can be walkable. So this is just, and I could go on and on about all the cases where we've got to coordinate what we're doing across all these sectors. So to summarize what I've said so far is, we've got the Keynesian neoliberal and eco-socialist approaches. The Green New Deal invokes the 1930s style public programs, but the reality is it's being implemented by the Democrats, even when they use the Green New Deal label. It's neoliberal. It's public subsidies for private corporations and consumers. And this market-based approach is hit or miss and uncoordinated when it comes to incentivizing the changes we need. So that's why we need the eco-socialist approach, and which requires a large measure of public ownership and planning in key economic sectors in order to make this rapid transition. Now, the last major point I want to make is we've got to emphasize the grassroots democratic core of our eco-socialist approach and see how it applies both to the delivery of our economic Bill of Rights as well as the ecological conversion of production systems. Now, historically, the basic idea of socialism was to democratize the economy along with political governance. The basic idea of eco-socialism in the 21st century is to meet everybody's basic needs within ecological limits. So 21st century eco-socialism is in contrast to the socialisms of the 19th and 20th centuries that were focused on social ownership and planning in order to rationalize and increase production to end poverty. Today, the economy is so productive, the scarcity problem has been solved. The problem is distributing what we produce fairly and also producing it in ways that harmonize with the environment instead of degrading it. And the other problem of 18th and 19th century socialisms were that they substituted top-down bureaucratic planning, usually in the state, for bottom-up democratic planning. And this is obvious in the authoritarian one-party states calling themselves communist, but it should also be clear that the Western social democratic states practice top-down bureaucratic planning in their nationalized industries. E.F. Schumacher wrote a book that was very popular with Greens in the early years, should be today, called Small is Beautiful. And he has a very good critique of these nationalized industries in the West based on his own experience on the British coal board in the post-war period. And the public programs of New Deal liberalism had the same centralized bureaucratic and anti-democratic problems as the nationalized industries in social democratic Western Europe did. So one of the things the New Left was developing in the late 60s and 1970s was a critique of the New Deal for being so top-down and centralized in the delivery of public goods and services. And with its themes of participatory democracy and community control, put forward very concrete bottom-up socialist and democratized proposals for delivering public goods and services like housing, healthcare, and energy. And that's the kind of approach we need to apply in our eco-socialist Green New Deal. So let me just illustrate that by talking about housing. The New Deal program was public housing, which was the direct provision of public housing by public agencies. And the neoliberal approach today is to provide public incentives to private developers for affordable housing, which obviously hasn't worked. And this neoliberalism was initiated under Johnson, who introduced housing vouchers and subsidies for private developers. Nixon consolidated it with his moratorium on public housing construction. And he rationalized the voucher program with Section 8 vouchers. And then Clinton closed the door on the public sector by getting the Faircloth Amendment passed, which capped the number of public housing units we can have to what was existing in 1999. In the US, less than 1% of our housing is public. In Western Europe, a lot of it is 20 or 30%. And that keeps rents down in the private market. So a New Left affordable housing policy that we were talking about in the early 70s was to build out public housing until every person had access to an affordable unit, but also that the administration of these units would become democratized. Instead of housing boards appointed by elected officials, we would have boards elected by the community and the tenants. So it was more accountable to the grassroots. Same thing in energy, which really was elaborated in response to the energy crises in 1974 and 1979. And we were calling for public ownership and democratic control of power production and distribution. And this model was elaborated really out of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington by people like Jim Ridgway, and he wrote a couple books on it. And there was model legislation in Vermont that Lee Metcalf, a Democratic senator from Montana, put into the congressional record. I mean, there were Cold War New Dealers like Henry Jackson that were calling for nationalizing the oil industry in those energy crises. But, Metcalf said, let's do it democratically. And he put that in the congressional record. So the basic idea was we'd have local public energy districts elected by the public, which in turn would elect a state energy board, and from there, a national energy board to plan out this energy system. And so it was much more democratic than the old model, and it gave people a way to speak to what they wanted from the energy system. The debate on whether you wanted to go nuclear or solar. Actually a public power system in the late 70s in Davis, California, forget its proper name, voted to shut down the Rancho Seco nuke and go solar and efficiency. That's what public power gives you. It's not a sufficient condition. You still have to choose renewables, but it's a necessary condition because the capitalists that are making money from fossil fuels and nuclear don't want to stop until they can't make no more money. And I was going to give you an example from New York. Maybe you could ask me in the follow-up, where we got a Build Public Renewables Act passed that DSA worked very hard on it, but the way it was amended, it's now a neoliberal act. And basically it's lemon socialism. The public sector, the New York Power Authority, gets to build a solar or wind project only if the private sector declines to bid on that proposed project. So it defers to the private sector, and things are going way too slow. I'll just give you one more example on this New Deal bottom-up grassroots democracy. In the 1970s, we had three models of healthcare reform. One was the public subsidies for, private health insurance with employer mandates. That's Obamacare today. That was Nixon's proposal. There was Medicare for all, to socialize the payment system, socialized, or they call it national health insurance. That was a Kennedy model. But we also had a New Left model for a national health service that was democratic. And it was conceived basically by the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which was the doctors and medics who patched up people after they were beaten in civil rights and anti-war demonstrations. And they worked with Ron Dellums to come up with a model that not only socialized the delivery system, in other words, the hospitals and the clinics and all the other auxiliary parts of the healthcare system, but democratized their delivery. So it's not a New Deal top-down centralized bureaucracy like Medicare is today. And when you got an issue with Medicare like I've had, it's hard as hell to get a human being to talk to. You get robots when you call. What it created was a four-tiered federation of healthcare authorities. The first level was community, 25 to 50,000 people overseeing a community health center for outpatient care. That would mean that disadvantaged communities would get healthcare in their communities. And the board would be elected 1/3 healthcare workers, 2/3 community users, or by those people. The second level was 100,000 to 500,000 overseeing a general hospital. And then the next level was 500,000 to 3 million overseeing a regional medical center, which would also have specialized services, medical education for doctors and nurses and technicians, and regional healthcare planning. And then finally, the fourth level was national, which would mostly oversee distributing healthcare funding on a per capita basis, as well as some supplements for disadvantaged communities. So this was a bottom-up thing. Dellums put that bill in 1977 and kept it in Congress till 1997. And then Barbara Lee picked it up, but she modified it, weakened the Democratic control, and then dropped it after Obamacare passed. This is something we should bring back as part of our Green New Deal. So I hope I made clear and sketched out how we can create bottom-up grassroots democracy to administer the socialized sector of the economy. And the last point I want to make is why we have to pay for this upfront and how. We don't have time to build this conversion of the energy system and create new clean production systems by incrementally paying as we go. We're going to have to make massive investments, which means borrowing. Military spending cuts plus taxing the rich is just not enough. You can go look at the Eco-Socialist Green New Budget, which I'll post after I'm done, and to see, the scale of spending we're talking about. Of course, if the Green Party adopts its greenback monetary program where the Treasury could spend money into the economy according to the federal budget without having to borrow it, that's another way this money could be raised. But pending that, we're going to have to borrow. And only the federal government can do that borrowing. When we do our state and local Green New Deals, we should also include what we're demanding of the federal government to fund what we can't fund by local revenues and local bonding, which is borrowing, but it's outside the annual budget. And as I discussed below, we can pay for this massive investment over time, like any good business investment that has sales of goods and services. So if the eco-socialist budget, Green New Deal budget that we did is even close, we're talking about doubling federal spending to make this transition. But that is what it's going to take. That's what we got to do if we're going to seriously address the climate crisis and also meet the people's needs for, their economic rights. So I'll stop there. I went more than 10 minutes, but that's what it took me to say it. So I'll put that link to the budget in the chat and look forward to your questions and comments.
So a direct question on your last point, Paul Rubin said, who is the federal government borrowing from? It's the monopoly currency issuer.
Well, it borrows from the financial markets. In other words, Wall Street. They issue treasury securities and investors buy them. And then that cash goes to the treasury to spend on these projects.
Yeah, and so to kind of transition to, how he said, a lot of these programs are so big that they've got to be federal, right? National Health Service. It's got to be federal. But the key is that local control, right? And so that's something we need to be organizing thinking about my own community, these issues of neoliberalism versus Keynesian versus an eco-socialist perspective are absolutely present. When we're talking about solutions to housing, we're talking about public. In my town actually is the town that sued over a century ago and went all the way to the Supreme Court to say that there can be municipal power. And so we were the first municipal power from how I've understood our town's history. In Springfield, Illinois, we were the first municipal power that said we could ban private power from our town. Now we have problems with that today because we have a rule that no one but CWLP, City Water, Light, and Power, can provide power. That has, and up until this point, included individual solar. So we can't feed back because then we would be a power issuer. Right? We need democratic control. 15 years ago, when one of our boilers blew up, there was no vote about how to deal with that. They just built another boiler. And now that boiler is one of the dirtiest in the state, and it's slated to keep running until 2045. And that's with the Democrats, passing what they consider to be monumental statewide CJA, the Climate Jobs Act, But as soon as they passed CJA, they gave our dirty power plant a pass, right? Because there's no democratic control. So even just getting something under public ownership is not enough. We've got to implement, that local control, that community-based democracy that has the answers, that determines the path of things. And so that, when we're doing our organizing in our community, what does it mean to, organize as an eco-socialist in your community? It doesn't mean running around and yelling about socialism, right? It means making sure that public ownership is on the table. right? That often these things are incredibly popular, but often our voices aren't, there's no voices espousing them, and so therefore people don't know it's an option. Um, you know, the sustainability council in my community has no interest in any of this, right? They are fully on board with neoliberal path, with the neoliberal path, with basically funneling public money into private pockets, for tax breaks that only people that already have, hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on a solar system, uh, to get. And so when we're doing our local organizing, we've got to keep these things, who is in control, and make sure that we're putting forth democratic community ownership as a key part of our organizing.
Yeah, let me just add one thing on how we pay for this in the role of public banks. One advantage of public banks is we can choose the investments to prioritize, unlike the private banks, which are just strictly on the way they can make the most profit. A public bank only has to cover its costs. It doesn't have to make a big profit. And it can create this money by creating loans. So there's a project, they give a loan to it, that money's created, and it's paid back to the bank. And we have a great example in North Dakota, the Bank of North Dakota, which is the state of North Dakota, DBA, as the Bank of North Dakota, doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. They're outside the Federal Reserve System. They've been operating since 1918. They've always turned in a surplus. They do a lot of partnership with local community banks. North Dakota has more locally owned community banks per capita by far than any other state. And they jointly make loans for everything from mortgages and farm loans to student loans, to small business loans, and also projects that the state is prioritizing. So that's another way, particularly when we look at, advancing local and state Green New Deals. Setting up a public bank is a big advantage and gives us a lot more ways to be creative and get what we want rather than what the market will bear.
So if folks have questions, comments, go ahead and raise your hands. Another area I'll raise that I've seen in my local community is housing, right? Housing discussions in my community, where we have massive areas of blight, massive disparities in investment, always come down into public dollars into private dollars. Every time. It's the only thing that's on the table. I just said we have a public power entity. There's a hotel in my town that is, it's called the Prick of the Prairie. I live in central Illinois. It's the tallest building in the area outside of the capital. You can see it for miles around town. They owe millions of dollars to the city because they're not paying their bills. They're just not paying their electric, and the city won't shut them down. And the discussions about that building are all about giving even more, about waiving those millions of dollars and giving millions more to private developers to turn it into high income, minimal amount of mixed income housing. They owe us millions of dollars. Let's seize that building. Right? Like that's a building that could be made into, and there was a proposal to turn it into low income, affordable housing, and it was rejected because they wanted to keep it as a hotel. They wanted a hotel down, another hotel down. So when we're having these, discussions about various issues in our community, we can always bring them back to this, question of are we taking the neoliberal path because it has permeated all the way down to our smallest towns, or are we taking, a new trajectory? So I think that's a key part when we're doing our organizing, making sure that we're providing that alternatives. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, things they'd like to bring up in their, community, One of the things I really learned in working with Howie in the 2020 campaign in regards to to the National Health Service, right? If you just centralize it top down, they're going to tell you how much money you get, and you're going to have to work. But if we go bottom up, we those various the various levels of regional service that Howie talked about get to say how much they need, right? And we can then base our tax rates or whatever revenue we're producing methods that we're getting to fund these systems. We can then, match that. So it's not about fighting over pieces of the pie. We can make the pie. Keenan?
Yeah, you mentioned about when somebody the difficulty of like locally when you have a property that you can demonstrate could be used as an actual for some kind of actual public utility of some sort. And one of the things that consistently is mentioned here is, well, that's our tax revenue. See, the city, they don't want things owned by the government because they're constantly looking for property tax revenue. And of course, they're stuck in that because of capitalism. But we can't get people's minds out of that. And part of the reason, too, that I think that we can't get people's minds out of that is they're stuck in that there's no other alternative, because the only other alternative is the lies that we have unfortunately heard about the Soviet Union, which I do not think are correct, that I hear often propagated much of the time. Over.
There's definitely a propaganda, piece that has to be overcome for sure. Mike?
Welcome to the 2024 Green Book.
Hello, I'm Mike Beilstein in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm running for the legislature in Oregon. My platform for my campaign is acquisition by the state of the natural gas companies that do business in the state, because they are unable and unwilling to comply with the state's climate goals, which requires I think a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 and 90% by 2050. And of course, natural gas, there's no way they can meet that. They're making up stories about biogas, but it's completely unfeasible.
And my computer is running slow.
So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that.
Play blocked?
I don't know who speaks.
Hey, Greg, you need to mute. Go ahead, Mike.
Anyway, I don't know how much traction this will get. It's I'll talk about it within the district that I'm running in, which is just Corvallis and another small city next to it, and it's for the state legislature. And I hope I can at least get my Democratic opponent to respond on the issue. That's well, I think part of the solution is that I think everybody realizes that the fossil fuel industry has to be taken over by public control. It cannot be allowed to operate just on the basis of profit. It needs to be shut down, but it needs to be shut down in a systematic way that protects consumers and doesn't create a disaster. But if we leave it to the fossil fuel industry, it's going to lead to disaster. Even if they decide to stop production at some time in the future and move into more profitable energy production.
Yeah, another area I'll throw out that, why we need a planned, coordinated strategic drawdown of these things is workers, right? We need a just transition for the workers in these fields. One of the things with the National Health Service that I did a workshop with Margaret Flowers, who helped write Howie's National Health Service plan. But one of the things we talked about in there was, the massive numbers of workers that are involved in billing, right, in the United States. And, There was a study years ago that looked at Boston's looked at a 400-bed hospital in Boston and a 400-bed hospital in Toronto. Boston had a 1-to-1 bed to billing ratio. That's how complicated our private insurance system is. Toronto had 2 people, right? Because most of their things got sent out. So, you know, and a lot of these, you know, one of the reasons we need to have this, you know, public ownership and centralized, you know, approach is that we need to be strategic about it. We need to make sure that we're, you know, doing it in a way that's effective and efficient, and that we're protecting, you know, millions of workers that are going to be displaced and need to be, you know, supported elsewhere. Howie?
Yeah, I wanted to address the question that these, I guess there were city councilors saying, oh, if we go public, we'll lose our property tax revenues. You know, people like that need to be educated about their own cities or towns. You know, the water and sewer systems are public in most places, and they pay for themselves with water and sewer fees. You know, if you go to public power, people are going to be paying utility bills like they do to the IOUs, but without that cost plus profit margin. Public housing rents, I talked about that. You can have them cover the cost of a project if you make them mixed income, which is good because it stops isolating extreme poverty in ghettos. Public transit fares, or going into markets that the market is not, you know, providing. Like, I live in a food desert in Syracuse. I have to drive 15 miles out of town to the suburbs to get to a real grocery store. The city could build municipal grocery stores and do it on a scale to meet the needs of our working class neighborhoods. And Milwaukee, the sewer socialists, not only built, you know, sewer and water systems and, you know, for sanitation, they opened up municipal grocery stores because they could provide food at a more cost-effective basis than, you know, the private groceries. This was in the 1900 to 1920 period. So, and when people go to those grocery stores, they're going to have to pay for the food. So you don't need property taxes. Public enterprises generate their own revenue. And that's what I think we got to educate these, you know, city councilors about.
Yeah, and Mary Lou Sanders says in Connecticut, we need to retool the war production machines. Sorry, it's blocking me. And develop a just transition system for all those workers too. And so one thing I'll say is, you know, in 2020 we called for a 75% reduction in the military spending, and I was representing the campaign on a panel at that point. I don't remember what small socialist party that was represented alongside me. I can't find it in my brain right now, but they said, you know, why not 100? You know, on day one. And one, if you think we're not going to need to defend ourselves if we, you know, actually achieve socialism, I think we're not being honest with ourselves there. You know, well, there still will be a need for national defense, especially, you know, if we succeed. But that just transition is key, right? We saw what happens in Iraq if you fire the entire military. You know, they will find another source and they will go to our enemies to become mercenaries. But something, you know, I learned in the campaign when I was researching something about why we need to be thoughtful with our demilitarization. I learned that there's 3 times more nuclear power plants on Navy vessels than in all commercial production in the United States. There's 180 nuclear plants on Navy vessels. Aircraft carriers have 2 or 3 most of the time, right? Those have to be decommissioned. It's going to take a long time, right? Same thing for most of our weaponry. Right? What's the quantity of depleted uranium shells that we have that we need to deal with, right? So we can't just shut it off today, right? We have to be safe about how we do these things. We have to consider, you know, the workers. We have to consider, you know, where we're transitioning them to. We're talking about a massive reorganization of not only our economy, but our entire society. So, just to keep going back to Howie's point, a lot of Greens are really uncomfortable with the fact that part of it's got to be centralized. But it just does, right? The time for a million local anarchist movements to realize, 100% clean energy is past, right? I wish it wasn't, but it is. It just is. If we're going to hit the scientific deadlines of 2030, we've got 5.5 years less. And so there's got to be a level of centralization there. And I know a lot of Greens are really, really uncomfortable with it, but we balance that with that community control, right? We don't just give, centralized bureaucracies the power. We take control and we give the power to the people who are being impacted on a day-to-day basis in their everyday lives. So that's, when we're thinking about these things, when we're having, we've got to make sure that we're keeping that kind of stuff in mind. Paul, your hands up.
20 minutes.
Please
so
mute
what?
if you're not speaking.
Josh?
Dave, you should be able to keep
Oh, the
Greg
owner?
McCoy,
It's
he
Greg
needs to
McCoy.
mute.
The owner guy? I got you. All righty.
Greg, you need to mute.
Chris, can you mute him? He's not hearing you.
I can't. I'm not a host anymore.
Okay.
Dave, if you go
I
over
can do it. Yeah, hold on a second.
Greg
There it
Jacoy.
is. Yeah. Okay.
Paul, you want to go ahead?
I'll let him back in if he needs.
You're muted too. I don't hear you.
Yeah, I don't hear him either.
Paul, I can't hear
Oh,
you.
you're muted.
But the screen doesn't show him muted. It might be something with his
I think
connection.
it was a mic problem. Yeah.
Oops, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
Yes.
a problem. I
Yes.
have to unplug my mic and plug it back in again. The question really only came up at the very end there when you were talking about decommissioning 180 submarines. I had short ships and submarines. I had no idea it was that large, but it has come up when I've been petitioning and stuff like that. People who are pro-nuclear. I am not, because I feel as if, like, where the hell are we going to bury all this stuff? Like, we don't have an actual solution to the waste that's we're producing. But I'm curious about what the Green Party's position on nuclear is. I mean, some people see it as like our way to get out of this, and climate catastrophe and stuff like that actually is a solution. I do not, but I'm curious as far as what the Green Party's position is and stuff like that.
Howie, can I give like a 3-sentence response before
Sure.
you dive into your lifelong passion here? I just want to say, I just said that it was too late for a million, bottom-up anarchist movements to reach climate stability. The time for a stopgap nuclear is gone too. They can't even build a new plant by 2030, right? So let's just say everything that Howie says is about to say to destroy nuclear, I agree with. But even if all that wasn't true, it's past. The time has passed. If we wanted to use it, it should have been done a long time ago. Howie's one of the reasons we haven't, so I'll let him really dive in. But I just wanted to, bring that up when you have those people, right? Okay, but it's not economical and you can't get it done. It's not a step. We're not in a stopgap moment anymore. We're in an emergency moment.
yeah, it's too slow to build, and it's too expensive to build. It's a diversion. You invest that money in solar and wind, you get a lot more power production. So it's a terrible idea. Besides the waste that lasts 600,000 years to be contained longer than humanity's been around, the potential for disastrous accidents like Chernobyl or Fukushima, and the fact that it's a failed industry. It only exists because of subsidies. Government helped build it. It subsidizes partial insurance because the private industry won't insure it. And now it's hanging on for dear life in states like New York and Illinois, New Jersey, with subsidies from the state. They call it clean energy. So these nukes that the owners want to shut down because they're losing money, they're only open because of ratepayer and taxpayer subsidies. But the thing I wanted to bring up was, you know, the idea for a just transition related to peace conversion and environmental conversion comes from atomic workers. And actually the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, under the leadership of Tony Mazzocchi back in the 1970s, after Mazzocchi and Ralph Nader got the OSHA passed, Mazzocchi turned to this idea that they're in the most dangerous, toxic, you know, industries that are harming their workers' health. And they wanted to transition to clean technologies. But they didn't want to do it by getting fired and losing their job. Most of them are pretty technical jobs, they're well paid. So they came up with, at that time, they called it a GI Bill for workers. You know, like when we demobilized from World War II, the GIs had opportunities to get education and housing and so forth. And this would be an opportunity for workers to get retrained and into the new industries. And, you know, we call it the just transition today, but that actually came. And they weren't only talking in the 70s about shutting down these industries because they're environmentally destructive, but also it's time to have peace conversion, as they called it back then. You know, we're spending too much on the military. It's now the post-Vietnam War period. We want our peace dividend. So, you know, we can reach those workers in those industries if we have a realistic just transition program. I have been on panels with nuclear workers, you know, that work at the nuclear power plants, and, you know, building trades, you know, like the boiler makers, they want to burn stuff so they can build, you know, boilers. Well, I tell them, you know, what you call it, the solar, the solar where it's, you know, the solar rays push at a boiler and it boils the water and you generate electricity. I forget what that's called. But, you know, what I found was the rank and file in particular, but even some of the staff and leadership, they were open to the transition. They just didn't trust the government to provide a real transition. And the example they gave, this is here in New York, was the transition money coming out of NAFTA. There was trade adjustment money. And where I live in central New York happens to be the area that got the most trade adjustment money. A lot of it was because factories closed the day after NAFTA passed, and they said, see ya, we're going to Mexico. And then the other big thing was the utilities started buying power without trade barriers from Canada, from the hydropower up there. But that trade assistance wasn't good enough. So, you know, these utility workers, a lot of them were in, at that time it was Niagara Mohawk, now it's National Grid. They were saying, you know, that didn't make us whole. So your just transition really has to be real.
Yeah, and so we're at time. You know, I think we can go a little long if anybody had anything else, but I wanted to pivot back to local organizing with that, right? If we want to reach those workers in these industries, right, a platform's not going to do it. They've been lied to over and over and over. I said that I apologized in my last workshop. I'll apologize again that I swear during workshops, but words ain't shit, right? They don't mean anything, right? Working class folks have had people coming into their neighborhoods cycle after cycle, making promises and breaking them as soon as they got this, right? Greens should expect to not be trusted, right? It's not, and we shouldn't take it as an affront, right? We're a political party, and we should be, you know, any trusting person is, or any rational person is going to have to keep us off with a little bit of, you know, keep some distance, have a little bit of trust issues with us, especially given their experiences in the American political system. So how do we get over that? Long game, right? Local organizing, building real trust, building real relationships. That worker, you don't win them over by saying that you promise they'll have a just transition. You win them over conversation after conversation after conversation, right? When I said earlier, you don't do eco-socialist organizing by going around your town yelling about eco-socialism, right? You do it by talking to people. You do it by relating to people. You do it by having conversations that help. The socialist organizer's biggest responsibility is to listen and help make connections, right? We have a housing crisis in my community. I'm talking to my neighbor about it. They're worried about their rent going up, right? But our city's only going to give more money to the landlords. Why don't we have public housing, right? How can we address this problem? Public housing can help drive down the cost. Landlords like to say that they provide housing, but they don't. They jack up the price because they have to cover their profit involved, right? And this is, true across multiple areas of public ownership, right? So when we're talking about that, boom, I can help make that connection. When they're complaining about the quality of our roads, the quality of our sidewalks, well, did they know that in our town's public works and the police department ask for the same budget almost every year? Police get 99%, public works gets 30, right? Those roads are a direct result of authoritarian police state policies, right? And so my job as a socialist organizer is not to throw marks at my neighbor, right? It's not to go to this big bookshelf behind me that's the nonfiction shelf and just say, read this, read this, read this. Is to have these conversations over and over to build that relationship to the point that they trust you. And then when you run and say, look, we're going to convert our city's power plant off of coal, right? We're going to end it before 2045 when we got our special little extension from the state government right after they passed a climate deal, right? Instead, when we have our relationship and we run, we say, we're going to take care of you. They're going to know I'm going to take care of them, right? Because I've shown up for them. Because I've been in their fights, because I'm living in the community just like that. So, I just to bring it back to that eco-socialist organizing idea, deep canvassing, right? Knocking on a door just because you're running doesn't change anybody's mind. Study after study shows this. What does is real conversations over time. So we've got to make sure in our local organizing that we're playing the long game, right? That we're not letting election cycles distract us away from that long game, right? I often get asked, where's the first green, when I do my organizing workshops, where's the first green congressional candidate going to come from? Who is it going to be? It's not a who. It's a what local chapters, what state party has the organization, has the base, has the structure, has the strategy to win, right? It's not going to be about a charismatic candidate. It's going to be about an organized base. It's going to be about an organized chapter, local, state, so all coming together to support a strategy. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure we're keeping that in mind. We need to be deep canvassing. I'll let Howie close off before we go because his hand's up. But then we're at time.
Okay, well, I wanted to talk about how important the anti-nuclear movement was to the roots and generation of the Green Party. In Wiel, Germany in 1973, 20,000 people occupied a nuclear power plant site for 10 months and got it canceled. And so in the United States, in New England, I was part of starting the Clamshell Alliance to do the same thing at Seabrook. And we only got 2,000, but 1,414 of us were arrested and we were put in National Guard armories for 10 days. It was national headlines, and anti-nuclear alliances and direct action against nuclear power sprouted across the country. And out of those movements, people like Rudy Dutschke and Petra Kelly conceived of the anti-party party, the Green Party, the party that had one foot in the movements and one foot in parliament, that was not detached from the people like the traditional parties, that was rooted in, organizing in, active in, and accountable to the grassroots movements, who would keep the party honest and driving forward. And so, the anti-nuclear power position is, we've had it from the beginning, but it was also important. And it speaks to Chris's point about, we've got to be working with people all the time and have them come to know us and learn to trust us. And then we have a relationship, and we can talk about the differences we have and have, a reasonable conversation because people know you're for real. And so I think that anti-nuclear movement roots is something that we need to maintain and actually get back to, because the government now is providing all kinds of subsidies to build new nuclear power plants, even though it's a crazy idea. Obama provided subsidies for nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. They failed in South Carolina. They only got completed in Georgia because the ratepayers were gouged, and the cost was triple the original cost in Georgia, and that took it twice as long to build as they planned. And they're planning more. That's in the Inflation Reduction Act. Joe Biden was the only, I looked this up in 2020 when I was running, he was the only federal candidate for president that got money from the main nuclear power trade association. And he's delivered on that promise in this climate legislation. So, yeah, we're anti-nuclear.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just gonna say the same thing. Thank you, presenters and everyone for participating today. It's good when it runs over. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. So
Yeah, I'll also say I know myself and I know for Howie, we're happy to talk to state parties, right? We're happy to talk to chapters. Zoom can get us anywhere real quick. And we're both pretty accessible. So reach out to us if you want to have larger conversations.
I'm gonna stop the recording. All right. Bye everyone.
All right. See you, everybody.